Hey there, folks. This is Misadventure, here today to share my thoughts on the first season of the 2005 HBO miniseries Rome. I don't have a script or any notes or anything. This is all just off the top of my head. I've just watched through the entire first season the last couple of days, so it is very fresh. I actually, since starting the Rome campaign, kind of got inspired to go back to this miniseries. And I've seen the first season through a couple of times before, but for various reasons, just things kept coming up, and I've never managed to finish the second season. So I am finally going to sit down and do that, although first I wanted to, of course, rewatch the first season. And I thought, hey, like maybe once I watch this entire show, maybe I'll make a video on my channel talking about my thoughts on the show, because there's probably a lot of overlapping interest for that from my audience. And after rewatching the first season, I honestly already have so much to talk about that I wanted to just go ahead and make a video, and then I'll just make a second video later that goes over the second season once I watch that. But this is going to be a video just about the first season of HBO's Rome, and I'm not going to talk at all about the second season. And I'd ask that no one really get into spoilers on that in the comments, just because I actually haven't seen the second season myself recently. But season 1 spoilers are completely fair game in the comments. This video will, in the latter part, be a spoiler review of season 1. Though first I'm going to start with a spoiler-free section where I will give my general overview of season 1 and my recommendations. So let's start with that. First, I want to note that this is an HBO show, so it is accessible on the HBO website. I watched it on there myself. I have an account, so I just streamed it off of their website. I think you can get it through Amazon as well, through their HBO partnership program. Not entirely sure, but it's in the HBO back catalog, so it's easy to find online from HBO's website. That's the easiest way that I can think of to get it. And I think that this show is of such high quality that it's actually worth the price of an HBO account just all on its own, but you can be the judge of that. And another thing to note is, on top of being an HBO show, so it's available through HBO's website, it's also an HBO show in terms of its content. It is very much a show for adults. I don't know offhand what it is rated, if it has a rating as a cable show, maybe it doesn't, but it is essentially R-rated in every regard. There's tons of violence, blood and gore, lots of just adult scenarios and themes, language, nudity, sexual situations, all that stuff. It's not as over the top as arguably Game of Thrones, another HBO property. I guess you could make an argument about that. I think it's less over the top than Game of Thrones, but it was earlier than Game of Thrones, so maybe they were kind of getting more comfortable being that extreme. But yeah, I think that all of the adult material and sort of the explicit material in HBO's Rome season 1 is, as far as I can really tell, handled well. It all feels grounded and appropriate for the story. Nothing feels kind of extra or kind of just there for shock value, if that makes sense. It all feels appropriate to the story being told, in my opinion. But it is a very explicit show, so just a heads up about that. If you are not an adult, you should not watch this show. If you're squeamish, you may not want to watch this show, but it's up to you. And with that disclaimer out of the way, season 1 of HBO's Rome is, I think, one of the best seasons of any television show ever made that I've seen. It is unbelievably well constructed and does something really incredible with what we often forget because of the precedent left by this season of HBO's Rome and the story that it told. It translated a very complicated story, and one that is kind of hard for modern audiences to really understand and connect with, into something completely accessible even to people that have no prior knowledge of the underlying history. Obviously, this show takes on a lot more meaning if you are already interested and informed about late Republican Roman history, which is when the show takes place. Of course, it involves historical figures, famous, even to the modern day, and I'll use the English pronunciation because that's how they say them in the show, Gaius Julius Caesar, Marcus Junius Brutus, and other historical figures kind of around them. It also involves arguably historical figures, although it's more so literary figures from Caesar's account of Gaul, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, who, although essentially characters who made up for the show, are technically mentioned in Caesar's writings as actual people in his army, so they may have been historical figures, but their role in the show is definitely largely a creative kind of fictional addition. So these were not historical figures in the way that they operate in the show. But they technically may have been real people because they were mentioned in Caesar's account of his invasion of Gaul as centurions in his 13th Legion, I believe. I'm not entirely sure if they were in the 13th Legion in Caesar's account, but I haven't read Caesar's writing in a long time. But the point is that these characters aren't exactly historical figures in the way that Caesar himself was, but they're main characters in the show alongside characters like Caesar, Mark Antony, Brutus, Cicero, and whatnot, who are historical figures. And I think that we often forget that all of the events surrounding Julius Caesar's rise to power and fall from power are extremely complicated and kind of hard to understand for a modern audience that doesn't really know about Roman political history, without getting into what I guess would be spoilers of the show's main plot, which is of course based off of the history. This is stuff that most people who've ever taken a history class about the ancient age would know about, at least to some extent, but I don't want to get into it until the spoiler section. Even though most people know the broad strokes, the context of what happened with Caesar and what happened with all the political figures around him is something deeply steeped in Roman political history and political culture. And I think that if you just read the contemporaneous accounts or accounts from folks like Cicero, who wrote a lot about this period, or the accounts of people a bit later on, sometimes maybe ascribing things to contemporary writers like Cicero, you get a lot of different kind of impressions of what happened and why it happened, but it's deeply steeped in very much Roman political culture, right? The actions that Brutus took were done because of the Junii's sort of legacy in Roman culture and very specific political anxieties of essentially the optimatus faction of real life, right? The Roman political faction, and the factional concerns that, while something that a modern day person can learn about and sort of understand academically, isn't necessarily intuitive to someone that isn't already versed in that history. And so all that is to say, actually taking the story, which is a famous story, right, the downfall of Caesar, and actually telling that story to particularly a non-historically versed audience and having it land is a harder challenge than I think it may seem at first, right? Even if people already know what happened to Caesar, how and why that happened to Caesar isn't something the average person would know offhand, right? The details that Caesar was essentially a populist and that his political opposition were paradoxically and very much at the same time snobby elitists and diehard sort of small r Republican sort of ideologues, which is a kind of notion that doesn't really happen normally in modern day political discourse. All these sort of political ideas seem so different from what we have now. And that's why often in my videos, whenever I talk about Roman political history, I always sort of have the disclaimer that I say, as someone that actually has, a degree in political science and is very interested in politics and law, I really caution against people making one-to-one parallel connections between major Roman political situations or events like what happened with Caesar to modern day situations, because although some things may be parallels, one can, for example, compare Caesar to modern day populists. Sometimes those comparisons might be apt. But the reality is that what happened with Caesar and his politics were very much a product of their time and deeply connected to a Roman political culture that most like modern day political cultures, although descended from it in many ways, are completely different, right? The way that most politicians work in modern day democracies is that everybody is essentially a popularis, a populist. Even politicians that allegedly are not populist by Roman standards would have been populist, because in most modern day democracies, there's either full or an attempt to have full, broad democratic involvement. And so the way that you can succeed in that is by being a populist, right? Either in a direct sense, as if your brand is that you're a populist, or in an indirect sense where your approach to promotion for yourself is essentially that of a populist. The kind of optimatus and boni factions from Roman history that play this role in the story of HBO's Rome don't really have a modern parallel, because that kind of political ideology isn't viable in a democracy. You can't really win in a democratic election normally on a platform of I support the elites and I don't care about the average person. Sure, many politicians in real life may actually believe those things privately and act like that when they're in power. That's certainly true, but no one runs on that as their platform. But back in the Roman Republic, many politicians did not think that showing even token support for the average person was politically viable. It would have been unpopular and kind of a faux pas to be someone seen as too pro-plebeian, right? So again, these are just like political, cultural differences between the Roman world and the modern world that myself, as someone who's fortunately had the chance to be a little educated in history, I know about this stuff, and so I wasn't surprised to see it in HBO's Rome. But for the average, TV watcher, the average moviegoer, they're not going to really know this stuff offhand. And there's always a challenge in historical fiction in kind of onboarding the viewer or the reader or whatever the case may be into the setting, which has all these unique cultural dynamics. And the challenge becomes, do you compromise on having the unique flavor of your setting and the unique characteristics in order to make the onboarding easier, to bring in people and immerse them in an easier way? Do you sort of streamline the setting to make it more modern in order for the product to have better appeal and to be easier for folks to kind of connect with, right? Or do you hold firm and actually put the work in to tell a story which, in terms of what happens and sort of what's going on, involves all of these possibly obscure dynamics that need to be explained to the viewer, but then you preserve the historical authenticity of the story. And that involves much more work, and very few historical fiction examples I can think of really pull off that second way. And HBO's Rome Season 1 is one of those examples. I think this show is genuinely a masterpiece of historical authenticity. Now, I don't say historical accuracy, because it's not a masterpiece of historical accuracy. If you are extremely well-versed in, like, deep, late Republican Roman lore, you will pick up on some inaccuracies in this show. The timeline, that's usually where the inaccuracies start with any historical fiction, but the timeline has some problems. Characters' ages are a bit off. Caesar should probably be a bit older. Actually, a lot of the characters should honestly be a bit older. If I remember correctly, I don't want to say this and be wrong about this, but Caesar at least should have been visibly older than the age of the actor that was playing him. But also, I mean, this is more of a technical thing, but technically, most of the characters should have been either played by or should have looked like and sounded like ethnic Italians. In this show, I think all the cast was British, and they're all speaking English with British accents. But technically, a more accurate version of the show, which, by the way, I would love to see this. This would be awesome. It would be a version that was shot with everyone speaking classical Latin, and they're all ethnic Italians. That'd be awesome. I'd love that. And if it was the same like script even, but just shot in classical Latin for characters speaking what would have been Latin, and they're all they all look accurately, not just like Italian, but like Latin Italian, from the Latium area, which all of the noble families, I believe, would have been in this context. That would have been great. And for example, Varenus's appearance is noted in the story. He's one of the characters, is known in the story as looking sort of Gaulish. And so if the other characters looked more Italian, that might actually help sort of establish how this character, who is himself Italian, or actually, is he Italian? I think he's Italian. I don't remember offhand. He's a Roman citizen, but either way, the point is that there are ways in which the show could have been more accurate. But to me, and this is perhaps going to be a bit of a hot take, so some of you may not initially agree with me on this, I think that historical accuracy matters less to historical fiction succeeding than historical authenticity. And to me, succeeding means not just being the most true to life, which is an important quality in historical fiction. Success to me with historical fiction is about onboarding new people into having a love of the history underneath the historical fiction. Regular fiction can strive to bring out some sort of emotion, to trigger some sort of emotion through its storytelling. That's something historical fiction does too. But historical fiction has another dynamic where it, to some extent, will, for better or for worse, serve as a representation and perhaps a alternative or a stand-in for taking time to sort of more academically learn the history. And so historical fiction that really screws up its representation of the history, it's deeply inaccurate, deeply inauthentic, can in many ways be very offensive to those that really care about that history. There's a lot of discourse right now in the modern age of historical fiction about the way many studios are choosing to approach things with the historical accuracy of their shows, whether it's the way that they cast certain characters in more race-blind manners, the way that they write characters to have essentially modern sensibilities, even if they're in a setting where their attitudes and actions wouldn't really happen like that in real history. And I'm not here today to say whether any of these things are good or bad or what I think about them. This is just a discourse happening right now. And HBO's Rome largely, sort of was made in a precursor age to this sort of dynamic going on. So in this show, all of the characters are very immersive in the way they act. Everybody acts completely in line with how they would act as characters in this setting. And the setting itself is so richly realized. And when I say the characters act in line with their setting, everyone is a giant asshole is the main point. Basically, all of the characters in this show are reprehensible people, and I think that's amazing. Because one of the most important things about telling stories about like ancient societies is to be honest about what that actually was like. I think that it's very easy to romanticize the ancient world. It's easy to focus on the shiny best parts of it, the philosophy, the amazing works of art and cultural innovations, or the sort of legacies of these important figures in history like Julius Caesar. And it's harder to acknowledge that not only are many of these things that we remember more positively like sort of propagandistic, right? Like the entire idea of measuring the Roman Empire's extent, for example, all those famous maps of the greatest extent of the Roman Empire under Trajan and whatnot, those are actually commissioned by they were commissioned by, what the hell's his name? Why am I blanking on? Holy crap! Oh, I can't believe I forgot this guy's name. Holy shit! Just give me a quick sec here. I remember his nickname. Oh my god, Benito Mussolini. I was gonna say Il Duce, but Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy in World War II. So obviously, before him, people talked about the extent of the Roman Empire, but the famous maps that everyone talks about of, the Roman Empire in 117 AD or whatever, those maps were commissioned by him in order to make a political point about Italy's past greatness as an empire, as he was trying to style his fascist Italian state in the 30s, and before that as well, but especially in the 30s, as like the new Roman Empire of the modern day. So the way that we remember things like Rome is not separate from political concerns in the modern day, right? Rome essentially was the first fascist state, and I say that like from an academic and historical point of view. I'm not saying this to load it up with modern anxieties about these topics. Literally, the fasc, right, the symbol of fascism, which is an axe head in a bundle of sticks, is a symbol from Rome, right? In the show, you actually see the I don't remember the term for this position, but the folks that carry the fasc around. Basically, it's a symbol that represents authority in Roman culture. And so the consuls would have a bunch of these sort of servants who would carry fasces on their like person, accompany them around the city to sort of show this person that I am walking around with, the consul, has the power of the state like embodied within him, right? That's what the symbol initially represents. Later on in history, because of fascism beginning in Italy, where it was, its modern version reemerged under Mussolini and some of his, colleagues, I think in the 20s. The reason why it's called fascism, like authoritarianism in that time period, is because the Italians drew upon Roman iconography when conceptualizing a modern revival of ancient authoritarianism. And so Roman history, not just incidentally or kind of coincidentally, has a connection with modern fascism. It is the original source of it. And at the same time, Roman political history has some really admirable things about it, right? It was a very striking state in terms of being deeply committed to its republican origins, right? This is something about Roman political history that, even to this day, I find really fascinating and really admirable, is that they, despite their republic not exactly having the most broad franchise, it was really just a very tiny minority of their population. But even to that extent, putting aside who got to be involved in the Roman Senate or the different, tribes that voted, the fact that their political culture had such a big focus on avoiding the concentration of power into one person, right? They essentially had an anti-king political culture, an anti-monarch, anti-concentration political culture. And the way that they achieved it was through their kind of crazy 2 consuls per year arrangement, which obviously led to a lot of chaos. But it was chaos that prevented, generally, any one person from becoming too powerful. You obviously had important Roman leaders that achieved power through their merit and through their actions. Arguably, folks like Scipio Africanus pulled that off. Sulla was probably sort of the first attempt of a Roman to basically become a full-fledged authoritarian leader in a more monarchical way. And then arguably his protege, Julius Caesar, actually did achieve that, although obviously things didn't go so well for him. And then Augustus Caesar, his, grandnephew, Octavian, as he is named in the period of season 1 when we see him as a younger guy, he pulls it off more successfully by having a different approach than Caesar. We'll talk about all that in a bit when we get to the spoiler section, but the point of all this is that Roman political culture, although it is very different from the modern day, and there shouldn't be one-to-one parallels drawn with no context, and also nobody should be looking back at Roman society with any kind of longing to return. Roman society was brutal and terrible for the majority of people. To me, the only ethical way to evaluate a society's goodness is by how is the quality of life for the average person, and how is the quality of life for the most destitute person. And because you can have a society where, on average, everyone's having a great time, right? But there's a tiny minority of people that are completely put upon and have a terrible existence. And those societies don't get to have a free pass based on the law of averages. But also, in general, harm needs to be evaluated based on its average presence. And so, if you have a society where, on average, things are okay and people do have protections, they do have rights, they do have lives that are relatively peaceful and supported by the state, that's a good thing, right? And when you're talking about ancient Roman society, putting aside the things about its political culture that may be worth remembering because they are the foundations in sort of Western thought of things like the Enlightenment and or the Renaissance, and then later the Enlightenment and the reemergence of democracy and whatnot, Roman society was brutal and essentially evil. And the show, this is what I love about the show, doesn't hide from that. It doesn't really shy away from that. Roman society was completely centered around, or completely built around, constant everyday violence between everybody against everybody. It was a brutal, honestly kind of disgusting society that, although it's interesting to see portrayed so vividly, I think the show does a really great job illustrating my point that I brought up a couple times over the course of my channel when I talk about Rome. No one in the modern day should strive to be like the Romans in a cultural way. The Romans are no one worth emulating. Obviously, it can be fun to immerse yourself in this very interesting ancient culture, but they're basically the closest humanity ever came to having an evil empire in real life. The Romans were a massive slave state, and enslaved people are all over the place in this show, which is completely accurate. Also accurate, and something I appreciate about the way this show handles the topic of slavery, is there's a huge diversity of what kind of positions enslaved people are in. There's your expected, chattel slaves, essentially, who are extremely mistreated, face constant abuse, basically have no rights and no personhood, and the show constantly is showing them all over the place in every noble house, all over which is accurate, right? And even in the story of the show, the over-presence of slaves in Roman society is mentioned quite a bit, right? But you have enslaved people that you actually have several characters, largely secondary characters, who are enslaved people from different situations. You've got, for example, and we'll get into spoilers and more character discussions later in the spoiler section, but you've got enslaved people like Pasca, Caesar's slave, who is essentially Caesar's friend. It's basically his sassy best friend, and you can forget that he's a slave, but he's Caesar's personal slave, and he's an example of essentially the highest form of an enslaved person in this society, where they basically are the confidant of their owner, right? Should be noted, by the way, that another great example of this is the sort of the female close friend slaves of what's her name? Caesar's niece, and then Servilia Junia. Appia Julia, is that her name? I can't remember offhand. I'll look that up in a minute. But it's kind of funny because they both have kind of female I guess what would you say? Sort of the equivalent of a steward for them, but they're both female slaves. And whenever these two characters who don't like each other interact, they're two enslaved female slaves also don't like each other, and it's kind of weird. But and you also see all these examples, for example, Cleopatra's enslaved person who is a dwarf, right? She has this relationship with Cleopatra that is really based around Cleopatra's status as a living god, right? And this kind of loving, protective relationship. So what I really like about the way this show approaches the issue of slavery is it doesn't just default to having all of the slavery in the story. Well, first of all, I should say, the first thing it does right is by having slavery in the setting and in the story. Any show about Rome or any story about Rome that kind of avoids the topic of slavery is morally wrong. slavery was an everyday and essential part of Roman society, and to pretend otherwise is unethical as a form of storytelling. Because it's like having a story set in, you know, having a story set in 1850 Georgia and pretending that there's no slavery. Like, you can't. It's morally wrong to not talk about that. That doesn't have to be the point of the story, but if you're going to have historical fiction, it is unethical to the history of our species to ignore super critical core parts of those settings that defined how everybody acted with everybody else, right? And so this show completely succeeds in how it handles the presence of slavery in Roman society, but also in how it handles the substance of it. Because it'd be super easy for a show made in the modern day, in the aftermath of American racial slavery, which is very different from Roman slavery. And actually, it was also very different, by the way, from much of the slavery of the ancient world. American racial slavery is a whole complicated topic. Obviously, many people have some information about it, but the way it worked in terms of setting the sort of establishment of a kind of view of different races of people and different statuses along racial lines and sort of how that worked, although those concepts existed before that, it sort of has a completely different character than Roman, I guess one would say, kind of class slavery. Now, the Roman system wasn't good. No form of slavery ever is good, to be very clear. But the Roman system just was different, and some folks who were enslaved in that system were able to get slightly better conditions. For example, if you're the slave of Caesar and you're his sassy best friend slave, that's not as bad as if you're, you know, a chattel slave in that system, or any slave really in the American racial slavery system. So it would have been super easy in the show, in presenting slavery, to have it just be a one-to-one parallel with the much more familiar to modern audiences American racial slavery. But it wouldn't have been historically authentic to do that. And although representing slavery would have been good, misrepresenting it as something that it was not historically would have kind of muddied the authenticity of the show. And so while I think the show does something really good by having slavery be a prominent part of its setting and many of its characters be enslaved or own slaves and talk about slaves and slavery, the show does something even better by not compromising on the historically accurate way slavery worked in Roman society. Something that to modern audiences is relatively hard to understand because we just don't have a perception of that kind of slavery. And many people that watch the show may not even realize Pascha is a slave. They may not realize that these female enslaved people who are sort of the, I guess probably a better term would be like a handmaiden to I'm just going to look up her name. Sorry, again, I don't have any notes or anything. Attia, that's her name, not Appia. Attia of the Julia, that's right. Attia or Cornelia, that they are slaves, right? And it can be kind of hard to really grasp that. And even the fact that slavery was something that in this society, someone who was not super wealthy but was kind of coming up, like Lucius Vorenus, a big part of his family's storyline is that they start to buy all these different slaves over the course of the story. But again, I'll talk about that more in the spoiler section. So this whole tangent about slavery in HBO's Rome, I really want to highlight as a great example of how historical authenticity improves this show as a work of historical fiction, because it essentially builds a level of validity into the show as a portrayal of this ancient society that was so different from our own. Some other examples that I really, really like is this show has an enormous amount of constant, overwhelming animal violence. People are sacrificing animals all over the place. Every other scene, someone is, killing an animal in the name of one of the gods. They're like cutting open their hands to make blood sacrifices. They're, praying to masks of their ancestors. This is all like kind of weird, crazy stuff, but this is all completely authentic to the Roman way. The Romans were very, very religious, and not necessarily spiritual. They were religious. And I'd make that distinction because many Romans didn't really have a super strong kind of sense of faith in the modern way. I think that in any kind of kind of Christianity environment, the way that faith is understood nowadays in a very post-Christianity environment, in like sort of Western culture at least, faith means something very specific from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But sort of before that, and in sort of, pagan societies like the Republican Rome, there wasn't really the same dynamics, right? And something the show also captures is that to the Romans, their gods coexisted with all of the other gods everybody else worshipped. They didn't believe their gods were the only gods. To them, their gods were the gods of Italy and of their state, right? In many ways, actually, the Roman state was structured itself as a very religious institution, right? The Romans believed that if they didn't do all of their rituals correctly, they didn't follow the religious traditions of their forefathers, the Roman gods who helped them achieve so much in their view in expanding the Roman state and protecting them from their enemies would abandon them. And this anxiety is actually mentioned in the show as a big motivator of many of the characters' actions. The show does a really good job capturing how even characters like Adia of the Julia, who you wouldn't really expect to be religious, it's completely on board with the sort of existence of the Roman gods. And in fact, one of the characters, Octavian, mentioning at one point that he doesn't believe the gods exist is seen as really bizarre. And so basically only the most kind of existential and philosophical characters like Octavian even could consider the idea that the gods aren't real to their society. The gods were such a big part of it. And the main thing the gods wanted was blood sacrifice, right? Whether it be animal blood, their own blood, or the blood of their enemies, right? Titus Pullo constantly prays to Mars after killing people or before killing people. So I think that's a big part of Roman society captured really well in the show. And some other examples is I think that the show captures like the vibe of Rome. I don't know if there's a better way to put that. The city of Rome appropriately feels kind of gritty and smelly. Obviously, there's no actual smells coming from a TV show, but the whole city feels kind of fetid and kind of like, ugh. Everyone is like sweating because Italy's hot, right? If you've ever been to Italy, everyone's covered in sweat all the time, and they're like, even the senators in their togas are like drenched in sweat. All the patricians are constantly like covered in like dirt, and the streets are made of dirt. There's there's marble buildings and statues in the Forum, but everything else is like made of stone and dirt. Everyone's like, washing clothes, and they're all crowded together. And I think that the show does a really good job at showing how, although there was, sort of classiness in the most sort of high class patrician environments, like their villa homes and whatnot, or not their villa homes, but I guess they're villa homes, but like in places like the Senate floor, everyone looks clean. But everywhere else, this is, an ancient society where there's not really modern hygiene, right? Everyone's kind of dirty and gritty. Also, something I really like as well, which the show does a really good job at not overstating, is the diversity of the city of Rome. So like I said earlier, I would have preferred that all of the main characters were presented as ethnically Italian, which would have been more accurate and would have helped establish the kind of racial tension that would have existed, for example, with a character like Varenus, who is said in the story to look like a Gaul, even though he is not a Gaul. But in the show, with the characters, the main characters are largely being played by, I believe, mostly English actors, they do a good job at showing how in the city of Rome, there's people from all sorts of backgrounds all living together. Obviously, the leadership of Rome are ethnic Italians, in the story at least, right? Even if they don't look like it. But it shows how there are people of African descent, there are people of, Gaulish descent, there are Iberians, and sometimes the characters don't mention their background, but their accent gives it away. Or if you're very keen-eyed and a big nerd like me, some of their clothing gives it away, or things that they reference. There are characters who, I think there's even a Scandinavian character at one point, or like a sort of, what do you say, kind of a, what's the word? Kind of like a Russian or kind of steppe character. But the point is that this diversity is accurate in the way it's presented. Rome was a giant cosmopolitan melting pot. Everyone in the Republic across all of its territory wanted to come live in Rome because you got, free grain and you got access to the aqueducts. And it was very safe, right? People forget, and this is something the show does a good job at reminding a modern audience. In the ancient age, a main concern for where you lived was where you're going to get killed by bandits. Like, it can't be overstated how commonplace violence from marauders or wild animals was if you're living in the countryside. There's actually even a plot beat where this is a concern brought up by some characters over a certain issue that I'll talk about in the spoiler section. And people would move from all over the whole continent to live in the city of Rome because it was the heart of the empire. It was presumably the safest place to be. Of course, in the show, it becomes clear it's not exactly the safest place to be after all. But I like how the diversity of the city of Rome, which is a historically well-documented part of that city, is represented but not focused on, because this isn't a show about the diversity of Rome. That would be an interesting show, by the way. I'd love to see a documentary about all the different colorful characters that went to Rome. And so with all that noted, I think I've hopefully created a spoiler-free picture of why I like this show and how it's so historically authentic. This is a masterpiece of historical authenticity. Everybody is acting. I didn't even talk about this part yet, because I already mentioned how, there's constant violence everywhere. There's like all these like references and depictions of slavery and all these different other facets of Roman culture. But all the characters act very accurately to that culture. It's completely believable, all of their actions and their attitudes. I mentioned already the stuff with religion and the way that they are constantly sacrificing animals. But something I really want to draw attention to that I really, really, really like about this show is the way it represents gender in particular. Now, what I really like about this is it does something that HBO miniseries often do a good job of, which is having, in a setting where there's a ton of gender-related oppression, you might say, or it's not a modern society where there's more equality. The show will have a lot of its characters be women to sort of show different perspectives from that position, as opposed to just having the show say, it's so tough for women, and then you never hear from like a sort of female perspective from within the setting. And I really like that because at the end of the day, if one of the ideas in your story is that women are facing oppression or they're in a less advantageous position than men in your society, I want to hear that story through the experiences of a female character or from multiple female characters. I also think that Game of Thrones and its original source material, Song of Ice and Fire, do a really good job of this as well, where fully half the main characters are women. But in the show Rome, many of the main characters are women. And in fact, I think the role of these female characters in the main plot is something that I think many hardcore Rome apologists, like people that are, in my opinion, misguided in how they want to preserve a particular framing of the history of the Roman society, they may not like that because the show makes some interesting kind of creative choices with how it presents the direct role of the influence of women like Cornelia of the Junii in how main beats in the plot happen, right? And on top of that, even putting aside political figures like that, Lucius's wife, Niobe, is a major character, arguably a main character, and she represents kind of a poor Roman woman, and like what's her experience like, right? And so what I really like about the way gender is presented in the show, putting aside the way that female characters have a large role in the story, which in a story as sweeping as this is, I think, appropriate. What I like about it is that there's no compromise. Same thing with the male characters too, but in the context of a gender discussion, there's no compromise on how women in this setting would behave and would act as realized people. I think that it's a mistake for historical fiction to try to sanitize ancient women and present them through the way modern women may act and behave. And this is true with men, but representations of women in media is something that's much more scrutinized than representations of men along these lines, even though representations of men in media carry these same effects. But in the context of representations of women, I think that it's much more interesting and important for the many flaws of ancient behavior, including how women would have acted and how they were socialized to be part of the storytelling as well. If we're going to have comfort with, discussing or sort of deconstructing the problematic, one might say, ways that ancient men approach their gender roles, that's a discussion that involves everybody. It's not just men, right? And obviously not everything here is like problematic or wrong or whatnot, but there are certain things that are very much like connected to their time and place, right? And so without getting into a whole history lesson about the history of ancient Roman women's culture as women, the defining thing that really drove like ancient Roman womanhood was their biological sex and their fertility. Obviously, this isn't a Roman thing specifically. Many ancient cultures and many modern cultures really prioritize these parts of being a biologically female sex person, a woman with prioritizing that part of your life or making that your central thing. And I think that what the show does a really good job of is not straying away or downplaying that. There's no modern girl boss characters in HBO's Rome Season 1. All of the female characters have agency in a way that is authentic to what they were able to do in the setting, right? I think that the three main female characters that I really think about, Niobe, Lucius's wife, Attia, and then Cornelia, all represent three different ways women could have agency. And I'll talk about this more when I get into the characters in the spoiler section. But Niobe has agency through her essentially romantic relationship with her husband and him eventually coming to see her as his partner and his equal in his decision making. But that's a whole arc that they both go through. Attia has agency through sexuality. She uses her sexuality to manipulate men and actually sometimes women around her, and she's very much a manipulator. And then Cornelia has agency through kind of poise and being diplomatic and being kind of a schemer and having a kind of aura of gravitas because of her famous family, right? And so these are three ways that women in this time period could have and did establish agency in a culture that saw them as less than human, as saw them as not full people who didn't have the same opportunities and rights as their male counterparts. Even noble women, like the two latter characters I mentioned there, and it's noted in the story, Cornelia has to do a lot of her political scheming through her son, Marcus Junius Brutus, whether he's wanting that or not. And that's like a detail that really highlights how, women in these ancient settings, even if they didn't have that agency bestowed upon them, they found a way to get it. And I think that's the most important part about telling stories about ancient women, is not to just wallow in sadness. Oh, it's so sad that they didn't have these opportunities. They fucking got those opportunities. They worked to find a way to get power and to get agency in their own lives. And I think that it's so much more respectful to these ancient women to tell those stories and not to just say, oh, it was so sad how tough it was to be women. Like, we all know that. And it's worthwhile to never forget about that, but telling these stories about how ancient women were fully realized as people in their context, right, and were able to have agency, even though it was so tough for them in those cultures, that's so much more empowering, I feel. And I'm not even a woman, right? But I really relate to these female characters because they're going through very human struggles and they're dealing with human experiences like, being put upon and having people, doubt them and not really take them seriously. I think there's a lot of value in really being able to tell stories like this and not just have female, and this is a whole other topic I could get into, but not just have female empowerment be about becoming masculinized. I fucking hate how a lot of modern storytelling around female empowerment is about them becoming men, and that's why they're strong. It's second wave bullshit. I'm personally much more interested in third wave approaches where you're focusing more on the innate value of women as people, right? Not their value by becoming surrogate men. I'm looking at you, Rings of Power. I fucking hate that show. Sorry, it really bothers me because it really bothers me because the image of women being strong because they're masculinized characterizations isn't on its own intrinsically bad. There are women that find empowerment by being more masculine. But to say this is what female empowerment looks like, to me, is deeply cynical because it limits how women can find empowerment into only being in this one way, right? I think there's a lot of value in celebrating the more subtle forms of empowerment and agency, not just for women, but for everybody. I want to see more stories that celebrate characters of all genders and sexes finding agency and power through their relationships, through their personal gravitas, through their ability to be clever and manipulative. I think these are all things that can be valid ways to gain power, and stories to this day still hesitate to have male characters that do these things really be the focal point. Anyways, that's a whole other rant for another day. But all this to be said, I know we're getting very deep into this video here, but to sort of wrap up the non-spoiler section of this review of the first season of HBO's Rome, I think this is a phenomenal show. And I think that if you're someone that's going to be comfortable and okay watching something that's quite explicit, this is a show I recommend to everybody, to fans of Roman history, to fans of history in general, and honestly, to those of you that are kind of history curious. I think that this is a very accessible show. It translates, and again, we'll get into this more in the spoiler section, it translates a very complicated political history, a very complicated culture, a very alien and different society into something that is accessible to a modern audience. But it doesn't do it by compromising the storytelling or the way the characters act or what their motives are. It does it by actually trusting the audience to learn about history. That's what I think is so impressive with it as a historical fiction masterpiece, is instead of saying you have to come into the show and know already about all the different families of Rome to know what's going on, the show takes its time to show you, here's the situation. It shows you over and over and over how these characters act, how their culture works, and it trusts the audience to learn. It trusts the audience to become interested in the history, because the show knows what it's presenting is interesting. And it doesn't have to change and compromise the core historical setting in order for the modern audience to follow along or be invested. There's no need to have some sort of ham-fisted comparison to contemporary politics, again, Rings of Power reference, to make the story work. Look, okay, I gotta talk about Rings of Power now. The Silmarillion and the Second Age materials are interesting on their own. Amazon could have just told the goddamn story and not had everything connect back to exact current-day contemporary politics in this one-to-one comparison that doesn't make any goddamn sense. The way that show approaches Numenor makes my head explode. Okay, I'm sorry. I was just talking about these shows. I hate it because Rings of Power, I think, is maligned for very bad faith reasons by a lot of people who are just mad that it has, strong female characters. But to me, Rings of Power is just a disaster because it's such a great example of everything wrong with bad historical fiction. I know it's not historical fiction, but Rings of Power is sort of framed like a historical fiction show because it's about the history of a fictional setting, not the real world, but you sort of get what I'm saying. I'll possibly let me know in the comments if you want to see a Rings of Power review at some point, because I watched that show before and I have a lot to say about that show as well, but I compare it to Rome Season 1 because Rome Season 1 does everything right. And it does everything right by having its female characters and its kind of more uncomfortable themes front and center. To me, a show like Rings of Power is a great example of how to sort of have an empty promise of being a modern kind of socially aware show, but it's completely hollow. There's no substance in what it's saying. I'd rather have a show where the horror of slavery is displayed by characters being so indifferent to slavery. That's a much more powerful message. The fact that in HBO's Rome, all of the characters are completely indifferent to slavery. Many of the slave characters, the enslaved characters, don't think that they, should fight for their freedom. And that's actually, even though it's very subtle and very much understated, that's one of the most horrifying parts of the show, right? If you really start to think about it. The fact that this is an institution in this setting that's so normal that no one even really talks about the idea of something like abolition. It's completely inconceivable to the Roman mind. And that is something that is horrifying, right? The one silver lining of the brutality of American racial slavery is that no one could look at it for more than 5 seconds and start to feel deep existential unease at how it worked, right? But to the Romans, to whom violence was this everyday thing, and their most brutally treated enslaved people could be kind of kept away from public view, they could have these enslaved people that were slightly better treated and not beaten every day, and they could basically not think about it and just kind of live their lives, So, all this stuff to be said. I think HBO's Rome Season 1 is a masterpiece of historical fiction, and I strongly recommend it to everybody. Now, having said that, I'm about to start talking about spoilers and the specific way this show sort of fictionalizes and presents the narrative of the rise and fall of Julius Caesar. And if you haven't seen Season 1 of the show, I beg you, watch it instead of listening to the rest of this video. Come back to this video later, because a lot of the strength of the show isn't in the plot beats, which are historical events that people can learn about before watching the show. It's the way the plot beats are framed and the way the storytelling happens more than what literally happens. If you just read the account of the show on Wikipedia, or if you listen to me recount it here, you're not going to get the same experience as watching these events unfold. This is a show, as a work of historical fiction, that is very interested in framing and really does something really interesting with framing. So let's talk about that now. So again, I don't have any notes, and I know this video has been a bit disorganized, but I'm just kind of sharing my thoughts on the fly here as I think about it. I want to talk first about the general storyline of the show, and then I'll get into the different main characters. So the general storyline of the show is it's about Gaius Julius Caesar he finishes his war in Gaul. He comes back to Italy, and he wants to seize power. And he basically starts a civil war with the Senate. He comes in with the 13th Legion, occupies Rome, and then he employs his historically well-documented strategy of essentially appeasement. Caesar's entire strategy to become an authoritarian leader was to forgive his enemies and to basically befriend everybody and just constantly appease everyone that opposed him. That was his main political strategy. And although he was a very martial person, he was completely prepared to use force, and he does in the show use force to get his way and intimidation, often not directly, although occasionally directly. He mostly has his more intimidating colleagues, like Mark Antony, his close political ally, be the one to do intimidation. But Caesar is completely prepared to assassinate people and be violent, so he's not a peaceful person. But his entire political ideology is, I'm going to use the promise of friendship and the appeal of joining the winning team to sway everybody to support me and let me be essentially a king, right? And whether or not Caesar, the real political figure, wanted to be a monarch, as was the main charge against him by the conspirators, that's a whole different question. Caesar, the character in the show, is very interesting to deconstruct. There's a lot going on with this guy, because he essentially is, in the show, most clearly defined by his sense of destiny and pride. He is a very proud, very kind of triumphant person. He definitely sees himself as having earned this unique, special status. He sees himself as above other people, and he certainly merited those sort of beliefs in many ways with his actions. And Many of Caesar's criticisms of the Roman political culture as it stands are completely correct. That's one of the most interesting things about Caesar as a historical figure, and the show doesn't disappoint in that. The Populares, and Caesar in particular, were basically right in all of their assertions about the problems with Roman political culture. The senators were too inaccessible. The common people were being, kept out of the economy by overabundance of, enslaved people and slave labor. There essentially was not enough representation of the common people in the Senate. So the Populares faction and Caesar as their sort of leader at this point in time are correct in what they were saying, which makes the conflict with the Senate so much more interesting, because the Senate essentially has the moral high ground in that they weren't the ones that started the Civil War, and they wanted to maintain the republican structure of the Roman state, right? Because Caesar clearly, whatever you think about him, clearly wanted himself to be in charge. He definitely was not looking to follow the norms of how power was not centralized in Roman political culture. They were very anti-monarchy, right? Caesar very clearly in history and in the show wanted to be essentially a king. Whether you think, and so this gets complicated because in the context of the setting, even though Caesar was more correct about his literal arguments about, hey, the common people are suffering, if we're trying to represent the common people, we should do more. His sort of actions to get to that point of achieving his agenda are more morally questionable. And so he's very much a character who's defined by ends justify the means. And I think many people that support Caesar as a historical figure or sort of agree with him in how he's presented in the show probably use that same argument, that Caesar's ends justify their means, whether it's because they agree with his populist politics or they agree with the idea that it would be good to have a strongman leader like him, that he certainly would be an effective authoritarian leader, and he was at that time. It's interesting because the show does a really good job capturing the complicated political dynamics of the conspiracy against Caesar. The conspirators are largely elitist nobles who don't have the common people's interest at heart. And at the same time, they're driven by, essentially, from their point of view, pure and morally completely justifiable political angst about Caesar destroying the Republic existentially, right? And I think that what the show does that I find really interesting, and that really, when I first watched the show, changed the way that I thought about this part of ancient history, the show doesn't say, or doesn't really tell you, Caesar was right, or Brutus and the conspirators were right. It just shows you both sides kind of embodying their different positions. It shows you the assassination, and it lets you come to your own conclusions. Was this justified? I think that whether assassinating Caesar was justified is one of the most complicated questions of ancient political history that we still ponder about today. Many people in the modern day would say that someone overturning a republic or democracy and trying to become a tyrant is completely wrong, and that violence against them becomes justified. There are political debates and discourses happening today where these things have some parallels. But again, I always advise, don't draw one-to-one connections, because the context of ancient Rome is so completely different than modern contexts. So don't even go there. But at the same time, many would also say that the ends justify the means. And Caesar, who was himself noble, as noted throughout the show, he was not a plebeian and did not seem, in the show's characterization, he basically seemed to not really truly be a believer in his politics in terms of loving the common people. He certainly understood the value of appeasement and generosity. Caesar's characterization really shows how someone who is from a noble background, who's from this sort of snooty, high-class position, came to learn the power of generosity and appeasement as a political tactic, right? His entire mindset is, I'm going to pay everybody bribes every day and constantly share my wealth and buy everybody's loyalty. That was Caesar's entire approach. right? And this mindset, which led to him being this populist leader, is the way he also behaves towards all the other senators, right? Caesar is constantly bribing everybody, constantly trying to befriend his old enemies. He very much is a political realist, and I think that's probably the most consistent way and the most accurate way Caesar's defined. Because I would say, based on my readings of Caesar, I've read some of Caesar's writings, and I've read a lot of writings about Caesar. Caesar, more than any one thing, because we sort of don't know how authentic his populism was. We don't know how authentic his popularis status really truly was. Was he a true believer? Was he a charlatan? We sort of don't know. But I do think something that was true about Caesar, historically and in the show, he was a realist. He was almost kind of a Machiavellian character. He definitely was using a very carefully thought through strategy to build a particular an identity for himself as a certain kind of political leader, one whom opposing carried a lot of risk and no reward. And I think that in many ways, what the show does a really good job of is humanizing Caesar. He is very much defined by his gravitas, and in the way he's played in the show, he very much sort of stands apart from other people. He is taller than them, even if he's not literally taller sometimes. He kind of seems taller just based on his stature. He basically already sees himself as above other men, which, as far as we know, is pretty accurate to the real person, right? And Caesar, on top of being just someone with a lot of personal gravitas, carries himself with so much sort of poise and personal importance, which a lot of it's earned, right? He was an accomplished general, a very good statesman, an amazing politician, so it's not unearned whatsoever. But I think a really interesting comparison to make is the character of Caesar versus someone like Mark Antony, who is also a character with a lot of gravitas, but Antony is very much more of a more of kind of a traditional politician in a way. I think Antony is more familiar to a modern audience in many ways, because someone like Caesar, who is very kind of poised and elegant like that, isn't usually the kind of thing we see in modern politicians. Antony is more charismatic in a traditional sense, and is more of kind of a bad boy kind of thing. I actually have a lot to say about the way that Antony is characterized. I may hold off on my big Antony rant until season 2, because I know he's in season 2 quite a bit, obviously based on the history. So I'll hold off on getting into Antony too much in this first one, but I will say for now, choosing to portray Antony as Caesar's kind of, presenting him as Caesar's younger protege is accurate, but presenting him as kind of a hot-tempered, emotional, kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, just sort of not very poised is an interesting choice. Antony was a very skilled politician, and although he was known for being ferocious, he wasn't necessarily like a Jaime Lannister type character. That's kind of the vibe I get, in a way, from the way Antony's played. Obviously, Jaime Lannister wasn't on the screen yet, but HBO's Rome was made well into the run of the Song of Ice and Fire book series, so these characters may have been on the minds of some of the actors or the writers. But, I think that Mark Antony being kind of a really driven by his lust is also kind of an interesting choice. I know that it's an easy comparison because of his famous relationship with Cleopatra, that I'm sure will be a big part of season 2, but Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, and actually for that matter, Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra, are completely, absolutely political. They're not based on lust at all. Maybe they were in real life to some extent, obviously. Cleopatra was a very accomplished woman, and don't you worry, I'm going to talk about Cleopatra later, because I have a lot to say about this season's presentation of Cleopatra. But before I get to that, Antony being a character defined by his emotion and his lust is a choice, and not one that I'm completely sure how I feel about. But hopefully season 2 does my boy a bit better than that. I guess we'll see how they present him. He has a bigger role once we get into the triumvirate stuff in season 2, but as for his season 1 presentation, he's definitely kind of overshadowed by Caesar, which I guess was accurate to the real life situation. Some other characters to mention before we get on to the conspirators. I really like the way and I say this in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, I like how the show just kind of shits on Cicero. Like, this show, like, was made by, like, the anti-Cicero gang. Like, I've never seen a historical figure that was otherwise pretty well respected as a poised and, like, stately person of their time be transformed into kind of a sniveling coward. Like, this show is very mean to Cicero, and I don't think it's completely fair. Cicero was very much a pragmatist, which is how he's played in the show. But Cicero in the show is usually there for comic relief. And this is, of all the characters I would have thought they might turn into kind of a comic relief character, I wasn't expecting Cicero to be a comic relief character. Cicero, if you don't know, is one of the main sources of a lot of our knowledge of this time period, because he was a prolific writer. He was a lawyer, so I can relate to him on that one. And he was a important political figure in Roman history, and his relationship with the Civil War and Caesar is a big part of his character in the show. I just don't like the way Cicero is characterized. So again, like, just to kind of say from earlier, I love this show as a work of historical fiction. That doesn't mean that I love every part of the show and the choices it makes. That's what I'm talking about now. So all this is not to sort of take away from my love of the show. I just am a little confused why some of these choices were made. I guess they wanted to have the normal kind of slate of comic relief characters, more serious characters, you know, all that. But also they wanted to have historical figures make up a lot of the characters. So I sort of get that. But I don't really like the way Cicero's represented. I wish that he had a bit more poise. He should have been more of a Caesar-type character with a lot of dignity, even if it was ultimately not going to help him in the end. That was Cicero's character. And something that I also wish that the show did a better job at exploring with Cicero's character was that he was not from a major family. He almost, in a way, I believe, was kind of, I think, was he a nullis homo? Let me look this up really quick. I want to make sure I'm accurate about this. Give me just a quick sec to double check this. I can't remember. Either way, Cicero was a really interesting historical figure, and I wish that the show kind of gave him a bit more respect. I'd be fine with them having more of a fictional character be comic relief. They could have had a fictional senator character play the same comic relief role that Cicero did, but we'll see if they get if Cicero has a redemption arc in season 2. I guess we'll see about that. And then, let's see. Let's talk about the conspirators, because I want to talk about all the senator characters in one go here. I really like the way the show handles Brutus. This is probably my favorite adaptational choice in terms of historical adaptation. And this is sort of the inverse of what I'm going to say later about how the show handles Cleopatra. Brutus, I think, is the show's triumph in historical adaptation, because up until this show, and occasional stories that chose to have this framing, most of the framing of Brutus came from the Shakespeare play. The Shakespeare play was written by a monarchist for a monarchist, Elizabeth I, who would have identified much more with the authoritarian Caesar and seen the conspiracy as more morally evil, right? That's why in the play, Julius Caesar, the conspiracy is framed as just evil, honestly, or arguably. I guess I'm not a Shakespeare expert, but the commonplace view of most people, right, when they talk about the assassination of Caesar, is to say, oh, Brutus was a bad guy, right? In fact, even before the play, you have like Dante putting Brutus in the bottom of hell, in the mouth of Satan, in like the worst punishment possible, because Dante thought that Caesar was awesome, right? And so history has not been very kind to Brutus, to say the least. And I sort of get it, because Caesar was, I mean, a big part of it too is that Caesar's family became the first emperors, and so obviously they made Brutus and his conspiracy very kind of historically unpopular in like how they framed things, and Augustus did a lot of propaganda about this. But I think what the show does really well is giving Brutus a lot more complexity. Brutus as a character is not super sympathetic. He is very much an elitist noble. He's probably one of the most openly elitist nobles while at the same time being not a very particularly good politician. He's clearly kind of not suited for it, and he's being pushed into this role by his mother, who we'll talk about in a minute, who's the real kind of brain behind everything. Brutus, as a character, is very kind of unsure what he's doing. He's kind of, what's the right word for this? He's kind of, what's the word? Sorry, I don't have a script again. I'm trying to just do this off the top of my head. He's kind of, God, what is the goddamn word? He is indecisive. I can't believe I forgot what that word was. And he, throughout the entire show, sort of doesn't know how he really feels about Caesar. He does seem to genuinely love Caesar as a father figure, which he tells Caesar directly to his face. But his change to ultimately joining this conspiracy and being its figurehead is mostly about his personal relationship with Caesar and not about the political and ideological stuff. Even though him and Caesar are ideologically opposite, Brutus doesn't really care about ideology, and that's an interesting way to frame this historical figure, because the main way Brutus is remembered is he was the leader of this Republican, small r Republican conspiracy to kill Caesar, because Caesar was this threat to the Republic, which in reality he was. And he was this, because again, the sort of historical shadow that he casts is that he was this Republican martyr, right? He was going to save the Republic, destroy this tyrant. And the show kind of shows how the show presents this sort of framing that this was an image the conspiracy purposely wanted to build around Brutus that Brutus himself didn't believe in. That Brutus was sort of out of his element and kind of just along for the ride, and was ultimately a very tragic character. Brutus's anguish at betraying his surrogate father, not only because of Caesar's mentorship of Brutus, which is mentioned a lot, but Caesar literally sort of being Brutus's surrogate father, having a relationship with Cornelia, right? This also, I'm going to double check I'm saying the name right as well. Hold on, just want to make sure I've not been saying that wrong this whole time. Hold on. Just a quick sec to double check this really quick. Oh, not Cornelia, or Servilia, that's right. I've been saying Cornelia this whole time. Sorry about that. I think there's another character named Cornelia. I was getting mixed up about that. Again, I don't have any notes with me, but Servilia, so apologies about the mix-up there. But anyways, Brutus's, what was I saying? Brutus's characterization is really interesting, and I think that it's probably the most interesting way they could have characterized him while still being true to what could have been. Again, we just don't really know what Brutus's real sort of identity was. And this is an interesting take that I think really adds a lot of complexity to the question. Again, the core question of this show really is, was Caesar's assassination justifiable, right? And I think that by having our main point of view into the conspiracy plotline be Brutus, by having him be characterized like this, we sort of get this view that even though the conspirators were more ideologically driven, Brutus himself didn't really care about that. His feud with Caesar in the end was personal, right? And it had its basis in ideology, but ultimately, yeah, I just think that the way Brutus is represented in the show is really interesting and really gives a lot of depth to a person that historically has been very maligned as very one-note and evil. I think that Brutus is one of the most sympathetic characters in the show, even though as a person he's not a very good person. None of the people in the show are very good people by modern standards. But even in the context of the show, he's a giant asshole, honestly. But he's a very empathetic person, and it's easy to sort of understand his struggle. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the show, honestly, is the dynamic between Brutus and Caesar. Now, as for some of the female noble characters. So I already mentioned Servilia, who I've been calling Cornelia this whole video. Sorry about that. Again, I don't have a script, so I'm just going off the top of my head here. Servilia is one of the most interesting characters in the show, I think, because this is a kind of character presentation I want to see more of, which is sort of scheming female characters, but very much in kind of a poised ideological way. There's a lot of representations of female characters, especially in historical fiction, that are very kind of scheming and that use things like sexuality to control men. I mean, in the show, Attia of the Julii, Caesar's niece, is sort of one of those characters. But what I like about Servilia as a character, and again, sorry about getting her name wrong, because she doesn't really say her name that often. Servilia is very much a great representation of what a Roman matriarch would have looked like, right? This is true to life for how a Roman matriarch of a great family would have power. And her power over Brutus is really interesting. Obviously, she loves him as a mother, but she definitely controls him through his love for her and his kind of fealty to her. It's very clear that although technically speaking, Brutus is the patriarch of the family, she's absolutely the one in charge. And Brutus deeply cares about following what she wants and connecting with what her desires are. And her, her kind of opposition to Caesar, for her, is very personal, because she was Caesar's lover for many years. And after Caesar, for political reasons, breaks that off, she sort of loses her mind and basically goes all in on being anti-Caesar. And one might argue, oh, this is a very, almost like a sexist portrayal, because this is like saying, oh, like this woman was spurned, now she's going crazy. The thing is, people do this in real life. Like, people are driven by their emotions in a kind of nonsensical way in real life. Men and women both, right? Everyone does this. And this is actually a possible explanation of this real historical figure and her actions, right? Because this is a real historical figure that's being adapted here. So I actually don't mind that this is the way her character becomes motivated, because her actual actions and her agency in the story is fully realized, right? A character isn't sexist if they are depowered. They're sexist if they're written in a way that isn't fully formed, right? And that's just a note, by the way, about like writing that I wish that more people in the modern day understood. A character who is flawed isn't like problematic, right? You can have a character that's uneducated. Like, a good example is Titus Pullo, who is in many ways the most kind of problematic character by a modern standard. But he's a completely, like, perfectly written character because it's all true to who he would be. Like, Titus Pullo is like a low-born soldier who has no tact and has basically like never had a female friendship in his life. And so all of his actions and what he says are completely appropriate to his character. And the show having him exist in that way doesn't mean the show is endorsing what he does. And I wish people understood that shows need to have flawed characters, even if the show isn't saying this is what everyone should be like. Most characters in most stories aren't there to be endorsed by the story, right? Stories that are just trying to have characters that they endorse, I think, are missing out on the chance to be deeper by having genuine flaws and complexity. But we'll get to Titus Pullo in a bit. As for Servilia, aka I guess Cornelia is her nickname now, I really, really like her characterization. I think that they did something really interesting with her role in Brutus's story and her own story, where she wasn't able to really hurt Caesar directly, so she basically she basically used the conspiracy as her way to hurt Caesar. So I think it's a really interesting way for her kind of role in the story to kind of be deeply connected to the final events. On to Attia, who is definitely a pretty interesting character. She is very much a character, she's very kind of Cersei-like, to compare again to Game of Thrones. And I think actually the way that Cersei was played in Game of Thrones was very influenced by the way Attia was played. In fact, let me open up my thing to check this again, because I have a suspicion about this. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that there's a parallel here. And I think that Adia is interesting as well because she has a lot going on, right? Like Adia, because the thing is, like, characters like Servilia do have complexities to them, but Adia has more sort of screen time, and so we sort of see more of her complexity with her relationship with her family. Adia is interesting as someone who is simultaneously like a genuinely loving mother, but also kind of a psychopath, but also kind of not. Like, Adia is very complicated, and I think that Adia represents a kind of another look at a different kind of Roman matriarch, where she does have powerful men in her family who would, in theory, sort of take her place as in charge of the family, but Caesar is sort of off doing other stuff. Like, he's not really involved in running the Julii family that he is the patriarch of. So she's kind of given a lot of power by him, both indirectly and also sometimes directly, to run the family. And then within the family, obviously, she has a son, Octavian, who is too young throughout this first season to really be in a leadership role in the family. And so Adia, by these circumstances, kind of has a lot more power than she might have otherwise. And Adia definitely uses her sexuality and her charm to control people around her. She, sleeps with her freedman, I guess. Yeah, what's his name? Timon? Yeah, Timon's a freedman, I think. So she sleeps with her freedman, I guess, employee, Timon, to get him to do stuff for her. She sleeps with Mark Antony, probably to manipulate him. It's sort of not clear whether her feelings for him are more grounded. I think there's some hints that they might be, but again, this sort of strays into Mark Antony deconstruction, which I want to save for the next video in this whole series of reviews, which will come later. But I think that the most interesting part is her relationship with Caesar, and this is a pretty understated part of this character, but she has a kind of interesting dynamic where she wants to sort of have her influence over Caesar directly, but she knows that Caesar isn't interested in her sexually really at all. So as soon as she hears this rumor that Caesar had sex with Octavian, she immediately is like trying to get Octavian to capitalize on that. So from like modern standards, the idea of a mother who would like pimp out her kids to their great uncle is kind of alarming, but in this setting that would be considered way more normal. Although I think Adia does go beyond the pale of what even Romans would normally be okay with. I think, for example, after her children literally have sex with each other, she at first is freaked out, but then she kind of calms down and is ultimately not that bothered by it. I think realistically, she should, especially for Romans who were still had their limits even with incest. I think she should have probably been more concerned about that even after she kind of calmed down about that, but whatever. And then I want to talk about, what's her name? The daughter of Adia. Sorry, I wish I had some notes just for the name so I could get this right. Let me make sure I get this name right. Octavia, that's right. Octavia. Octavia is interesting. Octavia might be one of my favorite characters, actually. Because Octavia represents something that I think is often overlooked when we talk about ancient societies, which is, and this is going to possibly be a controversial take on this character, the role of essentially children. Now, Octavia isn't a child necessarily. She would, by our standards, probably be underage. I don't know what her given age is in the story, but I think she's a teenager in the story, so probably not 18, not entirely sure. But Octavia's a good example of a character that essentially doesn't have any agency at all. She tries to have agency, but her own mother, who's her main antagonist in the story, essentially spends the entire season manipulating her, and ultimately successfully does manipulate her away from what was a genuine, although creepy, relationship with Servilia. So I didn't talk about this in the Servilia section, / Cornelia, I guess, but Servilia's kind of predatory relationship with Octavia is an interesting part of the story. I think that it's very clear Servilia didn't actually care about Octavia romantically and was just trying to manipulate her. But at least that's how I read the script. But the show frames it as genuinely romantic, which is confusing. Putting aside the fact that it's a romance between a much older woman and possibly a teenager, whatever Octavia's literal age is, even if she is of the age of consent in Roman society, which she was in the story, she had a husband, of course, that doesn't matter because the power dynamics are immensely different between these two characters. So I think that it's hard to kind of parse through how to make sense of that relationship. I think the easiest and most sensible read, given the rest of the characterization of Servilia, is that it was manipulative, and it was only manipulative. Maybe there was some spark of interest. Many of the characters, and I'll talk about the sexuality in the show in a minute, because that's another big part of my feelings on the show that are more complicated or negative. But Servilia definitely doesn't seem to have any other clues of being interested in girls or women other than Octavia that I can remember. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that, but I kind of read their relationship as mostly manipulative, and Servilia did at that point have stated reasons to want to manipulate the Julii, and Octavia was an easy target for that because Octavia is very naive. And so the reason that I kind of reference or kind of allude to Octavia representing children in the story, even if she isn't necessarily like a little child on her own, is she basically exists as a pawn for other people's manipulations of each other. And she tries to have agency, but she's constantly prevented from having it and ultimately doesn't achieve it in this season. Even when she wants to like go and like self-harm in like the tent with the monks, she isn't even like allowed to do that, which it's good that they stopped her because self-harm is never good. But I mean, even in that situation, you know, people seek out self-harm when they feel completely unable to have agency because it is one thing that you're able to do to yourself. And she wasn't even able to do that, so it just goes to show how limited her agency really is. And so I think that this is a great example of a good way of showing a female character with no agency while still being an interesting and dynamic character. Because Octavia is not just a helpless victim, she is trying over and over to find her identity in this scenario. And even her relationship with Servilia, which for her seems genuine and seems to be like something she really is excited by, is ultimately very empty, and she is completely destroyed when Adia correctly points out that Servilia is manipulating her. Which is funny, because Adia manipulates Octavia much more than Servilia does. But, yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on Octavia. Now, on to Octavian, a.k.a. future Augustus Caesar. I like the way this season characterizes him. I know from having watched parts of Season 2 before and seeing clips that his role in Season 2 is pretty different. But in Season 1, he accurately, for the time period, in terms of how old he was, is portrayed as initially kind of a young man or a teenage boy who is completely out of his depth and is kind of disinterested in politics and is just like a kid, right? And over the course of the show, he becomes more and more politically involved, both through Caesar's direct intervention and his own growing interest. And by the end of the show, his kind of academic kind of perspective on politics feels like it's in a position to manifest into the political cunning he'll have in Season 2. And I'll leave it at that because he's definitely the main character of Season 2, so I'll talk about him more in the video I do for that later on. But I'll just say that I like his representation in this first show. He does a good job not overshadowing Caesar, which he shouldn't at this point in time. So I like that. Although I do wish that they had at least some commentary in the show about all the weird rules he'd have to follow as the Pontifex. He is given that position by Caesar, and one of the fun parts about that position was all the weird things that position required. Like, you couldn't, like, touch people for years, and you had to, like, avoid sunlight, all these crazy rules, but whatever. Right, so let's see. On to the other characters that are not really in the noble families. So, and then I'll talk about Cleopatra last. I'm saving the best for last, because I've got a lot to say about Cleopatra, but I like Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. They're both largely, like I said before, sort of fictionalized characters that aren't based on really well-known historical figures, so their characterizations basically show only. And I like both of them a lot. I think these characters do a really good job, in particular, and their relationship does a good job in particular, of standing in and being the show's main way of telling a story about masculinity in Roman culture. They're both very masculine characters, and both of their stories in season 1 are mostly about their masculinity and their relationship with women. So with Titus Pullo, it's his relationship with, what's her name? Arian? Hold on. Sorry, I gotta just open up the character list on another screen permanently. What is her name? Irene? I think Irene? Yeah. Irene. That's how they pronounce it. Irene. I'm just gonna put this thing, minimize it. And what he does to Irene's lover is so brutal and fucked up. I really love it because this is how someone like Pullo would act. It's completely true to his character, and it's so shocking, but it really just goes to show someone being kind of a dumb, lovable meathead. You know, you sort of forget that they can be extremely dangerous if they are driven by their emotion and their rage in a moment of not understanding something. And I think that Pullo also does a really good job at showing the kind of importance to a freedman like himself of their relationship with the army. This is a big part of Roman culture, and pride in your service as a soldier is a huge part of Roman masculinity in Roman culture. Like, I can't overstate that. All of the male characters are constantly talking about the army and their relationship with the army, whether they were soldiers or commanders. And Roman manhood is completely based around military service. Unless you're like a rich senator and a noble, your entire identity as a man is your status as a soldier. And Pullo, as a very good martial, kind of physically powerful man, sort of signifies this this idea in a really great way, while not being very smart and being kind of emotionally unintelligent, but having a very good kind of wholesome heart to him. I think that his sort of redemption arc with Irene is really kind of sweet in a way. It is kind of like, there's a lot to say about, you know, her being a slave and him being a freedman, kind of how to feel about that, but in how his relationship actually happens, he doesn't really generally kind of abuse his power over her. It's hard to really say, because he's not her direct owner. Well, sort of. I guess at the beginning he is, but I think very quickly she becomes owned by Vorenus. So it's sort of hard to say. But by the end of the story, they have kind of a blossoming romance going on, and the whole discussion of can enslaved people have romance with freed people is a very complicated discussion that is beyond the scope of this video. But I'll just say that I like Pullo's characterization. I like how his brutality as a person is not underrepresented. And I think that the actor who played him, who recently passed away, that's one of my favorite performances in the show. Not necessarily the best written character of all the characters. He is well written, but not the best written. But the performance of Pullo is phenomenal. Just a completely embodied character. I completely believe this is a Roman veteran in Republican Rome. Completely believe it. Lucius Vorenus is a very interesting character as well. He is very much his whole arc over the whole season is about redemption from being a giant asshole. He's just a huge piece of shit. I really, really like the reality check that every show watcher gets in episode 2 when he comes back to Rome and meets his family. And he's just a giant piece of shit to them. He's like yelling at his wife and his kids. He's making them, feed him. He's like having like angry, disinterested sex with her that first night. And what I love about this is that Vorenus and his whole arc is one of my favorite kind of representations of masculinity in historical fiction, which is having a character in the story start off as the kind of worst case scenario of a ancient society man, where he doesn't have to, so he doesn't have any empathy for women. He is completely monstrous to his family. He feels entitled to everything from them because he has this legal right to it in his society. And over the course of the story, he doesn't transform into a sensible modern man, but he instead connects with them at a human level and gains empathy. And that's kind of Varenus' whole story. His tragedy in this first season is that his entire arc of developing more of a mutual relationship with Niobe, and learning to trust her and to confide in her and to make her part of his life in this very partnership way, is really sweet. And it's one of the most genuine romances in this first season. And it makes the tragedy of how that story ends so terrible, right? It's such a powerful, tragic story, because Varenus essentially as a character ultimately fails to truly achieve redemption. Because although he becomes nicer to Niobe and he starts to see her as sort of his equal in their marriage, and he becomes a better father, ultimately the largely I would argue justifiable scenario of his wife thinking he was dead and having what was possibly a not entirely agreed to relationship with her sister's husband. It's not super clear how on board Niobe was with that. There's, I think, some implication that she was kind of coerced by him, because he definitely seems more interested in her than the other way around. Although it's possible she seduced him, it's hard to say, and that's something that's purposely left up to be ambiguous. Her sister accuses her of seducing him, but of course she's biased about that. So we sort of don't know what Niobe's relationship with that guy was like. But ultimately, the fact that she had a child with that guy after she stopped receiving Varenus' pay, which, as they note in the story, was generally something that didn't happen normally, so she would have had good reason to think he was dead. It becomes complicated because as a widow, there's nothing really wrong with deciding to have a child with somebody else, right? And in fact, I would argue that even if you're not a widow, there's nothing intrinsically morally wrong with having a child with someone that's not your partner. It's probably wrong for your relationship with them. It's a wrong you're committing upon them. But in the grand scheme of things, at the core essentiality of ethics, having children with anyone is kind of up to you. It's just a bad decision if you don't want to upset your partner, and it's a good idea if you want to be in a healthy relationship with your partner to not have a child with somebody else without them being on board. That's my relationship advice to you on that one. But whether or not it was morally wrong to have a child thinking Varenus was dead, I would say it probably wasn't, right? The thing is, for Varenus, Roman manhood, the idea of being a cuckold, right, of having your wife sleep with another guy, is the greatest insult to his masculinity. Again, like I said earlier, Varenus and Pullo are both characters that are about exploring Roman masculinity. And so Varenus, facing this realization, loses his goddamn mind. He basically leaves the Senate, where he would have potentially, in the story of the show, saved Caesar, marches back to his house, and basically, starts destroying everything and is about to kill Naomi. This is a completely, it's a tragic, but also a realistic, complete collapse of his redemption arc. Over the whole season, he was becoming a better guy, and this weakness that he couldn't overcome, completely fucks it all up. And ultimately, at the end of the show, even though Niobe throws herself from the balcony, because she is driven by a lot of shame about what happened, she's not okay with it, right? Which is, I think, an interesting complexity to her character, that she genuinely seems to be deeply ashamed of her action, even though I think, even in the context of that society, thinking Varenus was dead, she did not necessarily do something super immoral in the context of Roman, by modern standards, definitely not, thinking that he was dead. But she clearly deeply regrets it, and knowing that he's alive, is deeply ashamed of it. And of course was hiding it from him this whole time. And what's really tragic about this is that they had such an amazing relationship kind of by the end, by, the standards of the time. And they had so much potential to have such a loving and sort of unusual for that period equal relationship. And Vorenus's Roman masculinity destroys him, right? Even if he isn't physically destroyed, he's sort of essentially destroyed. He's spiritually destroyed. At the very end, after Niobe throws herself from the balcony and kills herself, after he was, pulling out this knife, which, by the way, there's an interesting question of, was he going to, kill her with the knife? Was he going to kill himself with the knife? Was he going to kill the boy with the knife? It's sort of not clear what he was going to do. But she, in this last moment of agency, makes the choice for him. Again, not a good choice. No one should ever hurt themselves or kill themselves for any reason. It's never a good idea. And, talk to someone if you've thought about that. But she, in that situation, felt so trapped by this information and by where she was now. She wanted to, really just kind of give into that shame and lose that battle she was fighting the whole season with that shame. And so Vorenus, and that's ultimately what I take away from the Vorenus storyline, is that even though the inciting incident of their entire conflict ultimately was, Niobe having this child with that guy, that isn't what led to the tragedy. It was Vorenus's decision-making. It was his actions that fucked everything up. Because even learning this information, if he'd been mad but, heard her out, which he didn't give her the chance to really explain herself, he just charged in and started destroying the house. He is the reason she killed herself. It's not because she was overcome with shame in a vacuum. It was him essentially disowning her and clearly, visibly backtracking and sort of stepping away from all this trust they'd built. That destroyed her, spiritually and kind of at a deep moral level. And so I think, in a way, I think that Vorenus essentially kind of is responsible for Niobe's death. Even though she threw herself in the balcony, he was, probably about to stab her, potentially. At least he seemed ready to do it. And his, complete abandonment of their relationship in that moment and his complete inhuman fury is the inciting incident. And so I think that his story is very tragic, but also very human. It's a story about a kind of masculinity, dare I say it, toxic masculinity, that is, in its context, very much Roman, but is also something that has parallels today, as with all the other characters. These are stories that resonate with a general audience because you can see these kind of attitudes and these kind of human failings in the modern day. I think that it behooves historical fiction not to sanitize and pretend that ancient people were enlightened and modern. It's to show us what really happened so that we can actually look at ourselves and say, you know what, for all of our problems, we've come a long way. This is not behavior that is normal in the modern day, and it shouldn't be normal. And it's good that we've advanced from it, right? So that's what I have to say about Vorenus and Niobe's stories. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about Cleopatra. I fucking hate the way Cleopatra is personified in this show, in season 1. I don't have any idea what the hell they were thinking. Cleopatra is one of the most interesting historical figures in all of human history. She was one of the most self-actualized and powerful women in the history of the world. And this show decided to make Cleopatra I don't even know how to explain her character. She's so initially she's, addicted to opium or whatever the hell she's smoking, and she's a prisoner, and so, okay, she does overcome that and she manages to, go cold turkey, and she does recover from that, so that's great, right? But as a character, and I know that she is in season 2 more, so maybe season 2 will somehow fix this, but as a character, she is all over the place. It's not just that her characterization is something I disagree with. Her characterization is poorly done. This is, I think, by far the most serious flaw of season 1 of Rome. Her characterization is inconsistent, and at best, in her last scene with Caesar, she is politically informed. She's kind of a realist, and she at one point also speaks ancient Egyptian. And so those are all things that are true about the real person. So in real history, Cleopatra was a very smart woman. On top of being in a position of extreme power as the pharaoh of Egypt after the Civil War, she also was extremely smart. She learned a bunch of languages, including Egyptian, which most of the Greek leaders like herself didn't speak. And by the way, she was Greek, she was not Egyptian. So again, speaking of modern historical fiction that fucks it all up, Cleopatra was not African. There were African pharaohs of Egypt, and I would like to see some shows about those Nubian and Kushite pharaohs of Egypt, because that'd be cool. There were real ones, but that existed. But Cleopatra herself wasn't African, and if she was, she wouldn't have been dark-skinned, Southern African or sort of South African, or not, what am I trying to say? Sort of sub-Saharan African, or like Ethiopian. She would have been, if she was African, she would have been lighter-skinned, kind of Mediterranean African, as were the local Egyptians who were from the area. But she was Greek. She was from the Ptolemaic dynasty, who were Greeks. They were Macedonians from Greece. She was, of Greek complexion, so she wasn't like a white European, right? But she wasn't African, she was Greek. And so just putting that aside, as a person, though, she did a really good job at kind of learning about her largely Egyptian subjects as a Greek leader, right? A foreign leader for the Egyptians. She learned Egyptian in real life. She was very interested in politics. She actually took the time to make herself a very competent leader. She was a realist. She was pragmatic. Her relationships with Caesar and then later in history, Mark Antony, were clearly in real life driven by politics and not by romance. The show is very unclear about Cleopatra's motivations. She does initially seem to be focusing on Caesar as a political pawn. But the show doesn't really have enough time or give her enough time to really expand on that more. So I'm hoping season 2 addresses this, because this depiction of Cleopatra is honestly an insult to one of the most interesting people in real history. This version of Cleopatra hints at the reality of her intelligence and her conniving, but it feels like a giant misstep the way she's presented. And for that matter, I gotta talk about the thing with Polo in the tent. This is probably the most frustrating scene, because Cleopatra does, later on in that same episode, intelligently have a relationship with Caesar and have a child with Caesar, at least acclaimed as Caesar's child. We'll talk about that in a minute. In order to deepen her connection with this powerful political leader. That's an intelligent thing that real-life Cleopatra also did. She had Caesarion as in real life as her child. The implication of the show that the child is Polo's because, inexplicably, the fucking pharaoh of Egypt was just horny and wanted some guy to fuck her in her tent because she was like ovulating, because she said, I'm between the floods, so she was like horny. What the fuck? What the fuck is that? Why? Her literal justification, she says to her slave, is, I want to like be seated because I'm fertile. Did the writer of that scene ever meet a woman in the history of their life? Women who are horny but have a political interest in having children with a great leader because they're in a position like that are going to have sex without conceiving. This happened in real history, happens today all the time. There's a whole bunch of ways Cleopatra could have gotten off without purposely trying to get pregnant. Why did Cleopatra want to get pregnant right that second? There's no reason given at all. It's so disrespectful to the real person to suggest that Cleopatra, not just some character in the show, fucking Cleopatra, was so fucking stupid as to want to conceive a child with some random guy because she was horny, knowing at that point about Caesar being in Egypt. She was already beginning to scheme about manipulating Caesar. How about you just have sex with Caesar and have a child with Caesar? What if your kid, because she didn't care if it was Pullo or Vorenus, she was going to sleep with Vorenus first. Vorenus doesn't look anything like Caesar. Fortunately, Pullo looks more Italian. Vorenus looks like a Gaul. What if she had a red-headed child? Caesar wouldn't think it was his. What the fuck? What was she thinking? I can't believe that they chose to have that scene. Like, putting aside all the other flaws with Cleopatra's representation in the show, how they don't capture her intelligence, so they don't capture her political acumen, the respect the Egyptian people had for her. That was a big part of her real life existence, was the Egyptian people really respected her because she took the time to learn their language. She was very smart about Egyptian politics. They present her and they introduce her as this horny drug addict, which is a take about her, I guess. It'd be interesting to see a character like that. I don't have a problem with a character like that being in the show, but having it be Cleopatra is such a weird way to have this character be in your show, and having her make the unfathomably stupid decision to, because she's just horny and wants some dick, to have sex with, first of all, like a guy that doesn't look anything like Caesar. She's never even seen Caesar, I don't think, at that point. So what the... Fortunately, Caesarion being Pullo's son is only an implication that I don't think is confirmed in the show. It's just an interesting twist that Pullo and Vorenus kind of dwell on, or like it's a possibility. But Caesarion could be Caesar's real son. I guess we'll find out in season 2 if they talk about this more. But so Cleopatra in the show is a 0 out of 10. It is a disaster, and if not for the extremely high quality of all of the other show's characters, like I genuinely mean, like every character in the show except for Cleopatra is a phenomenal representation of that character, or a phenomenally well-conceived fictional character. Cleopatra is like a shocking 0 out of 10 in a show with 10 out of 10 characters, and I can only hope, I pray to Jupiter himself, that in season 2 they fucking fix Cleopatra. Please. I mean, the actress who got to play her looks great for the part. She looks Greek. She even looks a bit like Cleopatra's image that we have of her pictures and in coins and whatnot. So the casting for Cleopatra, on point. Looks great. Performance, totally fine. In the last scene where she is a bit more politically conniving, that was great. That was like on brand Cleopatra. But to have her have sex with a random guy because she's horny, sure, you know, just Pharaoh things. But Cleopatra was not just some like monarch, right? She's not just some, you know, stupid king or queen. She was like the smartest leader of her time. She would not do that. No fucking way. You can have, like, because again, it's like this sort of modern trend of like female empowerment by being just blunt, and Cleopatra was smarter than that. She knew that she had to be precise about who impregnated her. So I really, really don't like Cleopatra in season 1. So having ranted about that essentially sums up my thoughts on season 1 of HBO's miniseries Rome. Sorry again about mistaking I almost said it again. Mistaking Servilia's name for Cornelia. I don't know why I got that mixed up, but hopefully you didn't mind that. I know this has been a very long video. Some of you probably are gonna be pretty excited to watch this whole thing through, so thank you for sticking with me for nearly 2 hours. I'm going to watch season 2 of Rome and make a follow-up video talking about that as well, with hopefully a lengthy section where I praise how they fucking fixed Cleopatra, who will hopefully play a much more major role then. I know from the history that she probably does. But all that said, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about my takes and about season 1. I'm very interested to hear other people's opinions of season 1. Probably most of my audience are going to be interested in Roman history, so if you've not seen season 1, you should have done that before watching the rest of the video, so that's not great, but that's okay. Please go watch season 1 of Rome. I really, really recommend it, and I'm just really excited that such an amazing work of historical fiction with such a high budget and so much high profile was made and is available for everyone to check out. So with that noted, again, let me know in the comments what you think about what I had to say in this video and about season 1, and I'll see you all next time.